Now, burnout really fascinates me, and there are a few reasons why. So, full disclaimer, I have suffered from burnout in the past, and I dare say I probably still do suffer from burnout today in some form or another. Now, it took me a while to actually work out that I actually had burnout. And the reason why it took a while is I remember I went to my GP, and my GP, as usual, goes, "Oh, you're working too hard. Take a break, have a holiday." Now, interesting enough, I did all those things. I took a break. I didn't think I was working hard, compared to my 60, kind of 80-hour weeks that I used to do. And so, but that didn't change one thing. In fact, it actually kind of made things worse. And then I remember I said something to my colleague. I said, "Oh, look, I think I kind of have burnout." And he confided in me in return or response and said, "Oh, yeah, I also have burnout." And then since then, I've let off the shackles of embarrassment around the whole topic of burnout. In fact, I'm actually reasonably open about it. It's not that I go around telling everyone I got burnout. It's not like I'm on the public transport or on the bus and I go, "Hey, by the way, I got burnout." No, what I mean by that is I have come to a realization I can identify sometimes when people have burnout, or at least I may suspect they have burnout and say, "Oh, by the way, is everything okay?" And so on and so forth. And sometimes that just begins a conversation around a whole range of different things. Now, I'm not saying just because you're stressed at work, you have burnout. No, I'm not saying that at all. But what I have found is that I found it absolutely fascinating that, first of all, it really did take me a long time, 2-3 years kind of thing, to kind of get a general sense of, actually the ailment. I thought I just had a general health condition. And dare I say it, I thought I might have some form of depression, but actually it wasn't, kind of depression or anything like that at all. It was just kind of pure out 101 kind of burnout. And so this episode, I felt like I had to do an episode on burnout, purely because I know for a lot of my colleagues, they are suffering from burnout. And back to my colleague who I confided with and said, "Oh, I've had burnout." He said, "Oh yeah, I've had burnout on and off, for years." And we got talking about it. And it's interesting how obviously we know that it's a work-related phenomenon. But what is difficult about the topic is that the current research and the current kind of clinicians, whether they're psychologists or whatever, first of all, it's very difficult to kind of treat. Welcome to Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz, where academic rigor meets real life. I'm Dr. Stephen Stolz, educator, philosopher, and academic at the University of Adelaide, and this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, I'm exploring burnout, and I'm examining what it is, what some of the causes are, and how to overcome burnout. Whether you have burnout or you're just generally interested in what burnout is, today's discussion will provide you with both the intellectual framework and practical insights to navigate the important area of life. By the end of our time together, we'll understand what burnout is and discover some practical tips and some ideas that you can use in everyday life in order to overcome burnout. So join me as I bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stolz. So, because like I said before, where I was sharing my story, I went to my GP. He said, "Oh, you're working too hard, 60, 80-hour weeks." Well, they are unsustainable long term. And so, okay, I understand what my GP would say, other than sending me away and doing the usual kind of blood tests and the usual obligatory tests your GP gets you to do. It was purely, by accident, that I came across this article, actually, believe it or not. Like, it was just like most people scrolling on Twitter now known as X, and I came across an article. It was actually titled, Is There More to Burnout Than Working Too Hard? And I was like going, oh, yeah, well, that's interesting because that's what my GP said. Oh, you're just kind of working too hard. And I read the article, and I'm not going to read the article or anything like that, but I'll just give you there's like two or three things that kind of grabbed my attention out of the article. Basically, the article is about two characters, and the article is written by a psychoanalyst from the US in New York. And he's talking about two patients of his named Steve, not me here, and Susan. And so Steve is, kind of one of these overachievers, Wall Street types. And then, of course, the other kind of character this article referred to was Susan. So Susan was a music producer, quite successful one. And there's kind of like three kind of common themes that kind of came out of this article, which I actually found really, really useful. And that's why I kind of want to share it kind of right now. So the first one is it's quite clear that burnout is a work-related phenomenon. In fact, all the research says so. That's not to say that there could be non-work-related kind of burnout. Obviously, like primary caregivers, can also experience forms of burnout. But it's in combination of potentially either working part-time or full-time. So you can imagine you're burning the candle at both ends. You're working full-time or part-time. And then, of course, then home life, whether if you've got kids or not, it doesn't matter. It's still, there is a component, particularly if you've got kids, particularly if you're the primary caregiver, how that never stops. And so I can understand these combinations can obviously combine to make, kind of burnout symptoms worse. And that's why it can actually be quite difficult to diagnose too. But I'll get to symptoms of burnout in a minute. But back to my story of Steve and Susan. So three kind of things that kind of came out. So Steve and Susan, these are the characters. What's quite clear is that they're very overachievers. So they're overachievers, very successful in their chosen careers. And then all of a sudden, the bottom of their lives fell out from underneath them. So Steve stopped going into work to the point where he lost his job. And the same with Susan, lost her job because she couldn't function anymore at all, zero. So you can kind of see how it would be difficult to see how kind of burnout is similar to depression. And as I've come to realise that they're actually quite separate entities, they're quite very different, kind of symptoms, and they're different kind of criteria to diagnose each. So I'm quite happy to say, that they're very separate entities. But of course there is a relationship between the two, of course. But I'm not here to talk about the debate around whether burnout is a repackaged form of kind of depression. And there's a lot of debate in the academic literature around all of that. But I'm quite happy to see that they're quite separate because I intuitively, I think of my own story around how I clearly didn't have depression, but yet definitely had burnout. Back to my story of Steve and Susan, there is two things. So I've mentioned overachievers, very successful, and I guess it depends on how you define successful, of course. So if making money is your criteria of success, well, then, of course, these two would be successful, maybe in your own criteria. But I think what became very, very obvious is that they cease to function at all. So clearly this is something that just doesn't happen overnight. This is an accumulative thing that over time, it builds and builds and builds. And I know from my own personal experiences that, burnout is just something that just doesn't happen after one night, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year. It's an accumulative thing. So I thought, yes, that kind of makes sense intuitively and confirms my own kind of personal experiences. The other thing is that I found interesting is that with the story of Steve and Susan, is that each were leading the lives that were kind of given to them or suggested to them by their parents. I found that really fascinating that they ended up, so Steve becoming an investment banker, Susan becoming a music producer, because of their suggestions, or if you like, the shaping or the influence of their parents. And I found that fascinating because there's something really, really interesting here that's going on here. And that is one thing. So there's this kind of idea that at some point, if I'm not doing what I actually want to be doing, I can understand how existentially over time that would be really problematic. The other thing I found from this article is that there was this kind of sense that, oh, I have the potential, I can just do whatever I want to do. So if I set my mind and I want to, become a pilot, or I want to become an investment banker in this case, or I can do it. Now, clearly, these two individuals were very capable, and they could become an investment banker and a music producer and so on. But the reality is that there are two things here. Of course, am I doing what I want to be doing? That's one element that I think is worth exploring. And the other one is, do I have the natural aptitude, or am I necessarily suited for the job that in question? So, people would talk about best fit. Is this a best fit for me and my personality? And dare I say it, is this something that I want to do long term? I realise we live in a modern world, and the idea of doing something longer than 10, 15 years, that might have been from my father's generation. But yeah, long term can be whatever you want it to be. Let's say more than 5 years in the modern world. The other thing and this is the bit I want to kind of end with before I start talking a little bit more about what is burnout, is that I think burnout, what became very clear to me in this story, on these stories of Steve and Susan, is that burnout's not simply a symptom of working too hard. And that's what I want to emphasize here. So this idea of, you just take time off from work, have a break, go on holiday. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to change how you feel. It's not going to, if anything, you might feel better for a week or two. If you get that opportunity after a week or two, your body starts to de-stress. You might get some kind of physiological kind of gain, but then the reality is that when you return to work, those burnout symptoms will arise very quickly. So I think what I found really interesting is that burnout is a crying out for a need. And I think that's what the story of Stephen and Susan resonated with me the most. It was this point in their lives where they just couldn't go on anymore. Something in their life had to change. Something. I think that is the bit that I find interesting about burnout, is that it's simply not a case of working too hard, but I think it's a call, if you like, or your body and your mind is crying out, saying to you, stop. You need to reassess your life. You need to reassess everything about your life. And that's not just work, but that includes your personal life and a whole range of other kind of factors. And that's why I wanted to share that story with you from that article. It really resonated with me, and it said to me, there's something a little bit more going on. And of course, obviously an article written by a psychoanalyst is obviously takes a very different perspective about burnout. And he's quite right when he finishes the article. This is the author saying, look, not everyone necessarily wants to engage in intense therapy, 2 to 3 times a week for 2+ years. Not everyone can afford it. Not everyone has the time. And let's face it, not everyone's going to benefit from it. However, I still would encourage a form of therapy as part of an intervention plan around burnout. But before I kind of get to intervention plans and overcoming burnout, let's just talk a little bit about what burnout is. So generally, I should just point out that it's a phenomenon obviously associated with work, and all the research at the moment is obviously focused on the impact of how work contributes to burnout in some form or another. Obviously, it's a psychological condition. It's not a formal psychiatric condition yet. So it's not part of what they call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM. So until it hits that manual, it's not going to be an official medical condition. However, I think it's only a matter of time before it reaches the DSM manual and becomes a formal kind of psychiatric kind of medical condition. All right, so what is burnout? So burnout basically has three symptoms. So one is a feeling of energy depletion and exhaustion. Doesn't matter how much sleep you get, doesn't matter the quality of the sleep, you're waking up tired and you're constantly waking up tired all the time. So you can kind of see how it shares some similarities with depression. And of course, the other one, and there's two others here, increased mental distance from one's job or feelings of negativism or cynicism relating to one's job. So it doesn't really matter what you do at work. There is always going to be that negative connotations or association with work. And funny enough, when I was talking to my colleague Mark about this, another fellow colleague of mine, academic colleague of mine who I respect greatly, we talked about this because I said, oh, well, if it's a work-related thing and you're in a kind of, say, a toxic workplace, and I'll get to toxic workplaces in a minute, and you leave, say, toxic workplace A and then go to another workplace, shouldn't that then maybe alleviate your symptoms? And so when I mentioned that to Mark, he said, well, funny enough, he left workplace A, which was toxic, and then came to another place of work, and burnout continued. If anything, got worse. So I found that really interesting because sometimes people go, oh, well, you just leave toxic workplace A kind of thing and then go work somewhere else. Interesting enough, that doesn't necessarily always alleviate burnout. And then the third one is reduced professional efficacy. So let's just go through them, recap those three very quickly. So the first one is energy depletion and exhaustion. Second one is feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And then the third one was reduced professional efficacy. I can understand how that one would be a contributing factor as well. All right, so if you are wondering how I can identify whether I have burnout or not, and I did this myself, and that's why I'm mentioning it, is that you can complete what's called the Sydney Burnout Measure. If you just go to any search engine and type that in, it should come up. And it's quite a simple kind of questionnaire to complete, and you fill it out and you add up the scores, and the highest score is 102. And of course, if you are at that higher end, then clearly you have high rates or high levels of burnout. Interesting enough, when I did the Sydney Burnout Measure, mine was over 100, and I won't tell you what it is at the moment. It's not quite 100 at the moment, but, it's still pretty high. So obviously the first thing you need to do is just complete the questionnaire, and then obviously that's your starting point. And of course, it took me a while to finally get to that point, but when I did get there, okay, like anything, of course you go, well, all right, so what, I've got burnout, so what do I do next? Yes, that is the question. So some of the causes of burnout, I've already kind of alluded to it, but they are work causes. Obviously, work, a major contributor without a doubt is work. And so I actually went through this list, and I actually went through it with a colleague of mine, and I just, because there's 13 on this kind of list, in terms of how does work cause burnout. And there's about kind of like 13. You can almost treat it as like a questionnaire of sorts. Anyway, we were going through it, and out of that 13, I think in different workplaces I've worked in, I swear I would tick yes for each one, almost where I got 12 out of 13. And I want to read some of those because we laughed our head off. We laughed and laughed our head off for some of them. So I'm just going to read some of them, and I go through, I'm going to comment on some of them. So the first one is workplace environmental issues. Yeah, noise, lighting, temperature. Yeah, so of course you work in a busy kind of workspace. Yeah, over time, that kind of wears on you. It really does. Next one is workload. Well, we already know that workload is a contributing factor, particularly excessive workloads over long periods of time. Like I said before earlier on, I was doing 60, 70, 80 hours a week. Now, you can't sustain that long term. I tried hard, but then I just fell in a massive heap very quickly, just both physically, tried to maintain it. Anyway, enough about me, but it will catch up with you at some point, whether physically or psychologically. lengthy work hours and time pressure. It's more the time pressure, I think, is the big one. If you're going to block 60, 70, 80 hours a week, of course you're going to do long hours, but it's the time pressure. That not only is that stressful, but it's the time pressure. Time pressure, time pressure, time pressure. And I think of all the time-sensitive deadlines that I have to deal with on a constant basis. And over time, that really does kind of wear on you. Low role efficacy. Interesting. That one comes up because that's obviously part of one of the symptoms that I was referring to before around burnout. So if you don't have any control about your work day, over time, that is problematic. Role conflict, role ambiguity. So if you've got no idea, these are two separate entities, but if you've got role conflict and role ambiguity and you're not sure what you're supposed to be doing, or your colleague is supposed to be doing the same thing as you, clearly that's a problem. Compromise, career development. Wow. The chances of not being promoted. I'm sorry. That not only is that a demoralizing and a demotivating effect over time, I would say demoralizing and just kind of disheartening. That's really, really, really tough. If you feel like you're in an organization, you're going nowhere fast. I think that's definitely a contributing factor. And this next one is a big one. I'm going to read this one because I really like this one, because I know when I have conversations with a whole heap of different people, this one comes up time and time and time again. So I'll read this one. A mismatch between the norms, goals, and rules of an organization and the values and objectives of the individual. Yes. How many times have I seen that one? So you have an organization say that, this is what we believe in, our values, our beliefs, and yet if there's a mismatch with your own values and beliefs, that is a recipe for disaster. Next one, lack of control and autonomy for the employee in organising their own work activities. So whether in relation to time and methods. So if you have a boss who not only just micromanages you, but is there like in a factory, making sure that you're there at 9 o'clock and you're leaving at 5 o'clock, and then says something to you like, "Oh, Stephen, I saw you you left at, you left at 4:55 and you're supposed to leave at 5. Well, not only is that going to give people the shits, right? But over time, that's really problematic. Obviously, there's an erosion of trust, but then, of course, you have, like I said before, that's problematic for any notion of efficacy, particularly professional efficacy. Next one, absence of or minimal rewards, or worse, non-contingent punishment or injustice in the organisation and appraisal and reward system. Oh, yeah. Don't I know a lot about this one? So if you see other people who are misbehaving and yet being rewarded for that misbehaviour and even getting promoted, that's crushing. That is crushing. And then if you're then in turn being, if you like, perceived to be picked on for doing the same things others were doing, that's just really problematic. And I could just go on and on. Of course, I'm just giving you some just kind of my own kind of off-the-cuff examples from my end. Organisational changes. Well, don't I know a lot about these? Restructures, downsizing, mergers. Well, I'm going through a merger right now, going through another restructure. Not only are they stressful, but they are very, very, very difficult things to get through. That's if you survive them or not. And then lack of social support in the system and organisation. Well, if you don't have anyone you can talk to, or no one listens to you, no one appreciates you, or if you have got no emotional support, over time, that's a problem. And then the last one, lack of fairness, equity with your supervisor or line manager, particularly if all they want to do is just kind of maintain power over their employees. That's that micromanagement stuff. That's all that stuff that really piss people off. If you have a line manager or manager, all they do is micromanage you. That's a real killer. So I've already mentioned the toxic workplace. Yes, definitely. I've worked in many of them. And so as I would have mentioned to you before about my colleague Mark, sometimes it's not as simple as leaving workplace A that's toxic and then moving to another workplace. And sometimes it just makes things worse. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, about why. Now, as for some of the occupations, so what are some of the occupations that are high risk for burnout? Burnout is consistently shown to be more likely for those who work in people professions, where the worker is involved in regular and usually demanding interactions with other people. The interaction isn't necessarily the primary factor, but likely to be the demands connected to the interactions. In terms of professions or occupations most at risk, the list over the decades hasn't changed too much, and it's rather consistent. Towards the top of the list are healthcare workers, like medical doctors, nurses, social workers, dentists, and veterinarians. Then come teachers, lawyers, police officers, and senior managers. Full-time carers are rarely listed, and so there is a gap in the research that needs to be explored. There is one other component here that I discovered in my research that I found really fascinating, is this notion of perfectionism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but one of the causes that kind of shocked me a little bit. So we've already mentioned work as a cause. That's definitely a contributing factor. Second kind of cause is stress. Without a doubt, I'm going to actually do an episode on stress. But the third one, which kind of surprised me a little bit in my research, was perfectionism. And I tell you, I was kind of surprised. So first of all, for a lot of professions, perfectionism is actually cultivated and it's actually required and needed. For instance, you need to be diligent, dutiful, conscientious, persevere, you need to be focused, and so on. I get all that. That makes sense. It makes complete sense to me. But then at the other end, and they talk about it in the literature about it as healthy perfectionism, which is kind of a bit of an oxymoron, really. Seriously, how can you have healthy perfectionism, really? But anyway, let's not worry about concepts here at the moment. But I think where it becomes problematic, so I think if you look at it like this, healthy perfectionism at one end of the continuum and then maladjusted or negative forms of perfectionism would be on the other end of the scale. And clearly there is a tipping point. And obviously once you get past that tipping point and you're at the other end of the scale where it's more maladjusted perfectionism, the negative type, where you basically like procrastination because you're so fearful of making a mistake that you do nothing at all. So that's really on the right end of the other end of the extreme, where you're fearful about just doing anything and you kind of can't tolerate any ambiguity. Everything is kind of like black and white, not grey, all the way through to kind of catastrophizing, perceiving problems which are not there. I get all that. That's at the other end. But what's going on for you to kind of tip across that threshold towards the maladjusted level? And that's the bit I'm 100%, I don't really know, and I can't answer that. And so I actually am going to do an episode on perfectionism as part of my podcast, because I actually really want to know more about what's going on here in relation to perfectionism. So let's just quickly recap. So some of the causes, already spoken about work. Second one is obviously stress, how we respond to stress. And then the third one is a personality kind of component around traits, which I've spoken to you about in terms of perfectionism. Now that's an interesting one, and that's the one that kind of shocked me a little bit. All right, so by now you're probably wondering, well, what the hell can I do to overcome burnout? And this will close us out and bring us to the end of this episode on burnout. And I guess this is the bit where obviously once I identified I had burnout, understood a little bit more about burnout, obviously inevitably you want to know about, well, look, how can I overcome burnout? Like, what can I do? That's a logical kind of question to ask. Look, what I found, and what I'm about to say won't surprise you, but there's no one size that fits all. Now, that's patronizing and it kind of pisses me off a little bit when people say that. However, what I would say is that it is worth trialing things. So I ended up doing things that I would never, ever do, ever, just to see if they worked. And I'm not just talking about just doing it once and, no, I don't like it, forget about it. No, I meant as in I honestly gave it a go. And I'll talk to you a little bit about some of those. So the first one really that I want to kind of mention is work. Now, work is a tricky one. Not all of us have the luxury of being able to kind of leave your workplace completely and just do something else, or leave your workplace and just go to another job. So that's not always possible. And like I said before, sometimes it's not even advisable. It's not really going to alleviate some of the symptoms of burnout. So work's a tricky one. without a doubt. The other one that I think we have a little bit more autonomy and control over is de-stressing type strategies. So these are some of the ones that I found that have worked well for me. Talking to someone and seeking support. So that could just be a loved one. It could be your spouse or partner. It could be a mate. It could just be Turbo down at the pub, at the public bar. And in fact, I would argue that's the place of the pub and what used to happen. You would go to the pub. It would just be a kind of pseudo kind of counselling session where people would kind of share what's going on in their lives. And they kind of just like get it off their kind of chest. Today, not many people drink today. Turbo's still at the pub, but not many people drink today. So this is where we need to find face-to-face human interaction. And I don't mean as in Zoom. I'm actually being quite deliberate when I say here it has to be face-to-face human interaction with someone who cares about you and is prepared to listen to you. And if you can't find someone, then I would say then this is where that therapy, you find a clinical psychologist or a counsellor or just someone, if you're religious, maybe a priest, you find someone who's prepared to listen to you. I think that is really important. And I guess that's what I found fascinating about Steve and Susan, is that they were in therapy, intense therapy, for 2 to 3 years before they came to some of those discoveries. So that's why I said to you, do not rule out therapy. Therapy definitely is piece of the puzzle here, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Next one is exercise. Now, I don't necessarily mean you have to go to the gym and you have to smash it out 2 to 3 times a week. No, that's not what I mean. It really could be as simple as just going for a walk. It could be 10-minute walk, all the way up to 30 minutes or more. I would advise at least 30 minutes. Okay, we already know about the 10,000 steps. So if you want to equate that to 10,000 steps, that's fine. But I just say you got to start somewhere. And so if that's just 10 minutes and then gets to 30 minutes or more, that's great. Idea, I'd say minimum 30 minutes of walking. And that could just be a leisurely stroll in the park. In fact, the reason why I've just mentioned the park or nature is that I found nature, particularly nature in green spaces, to be incredibly soothing effect. In fact, there's a fair bit of psychological work or studies that have been done on this to show how green spaces are incredibly psychologically soothing to individuals. And all the way through to animals, particularly dogs, definitely can have a soothing effect. And I guess that's why a lot of people actually have animals. It doesn't have to be a dog, it could be a cat, but just animals in general, without a doubt. Mindfulness and meditation. Now, I was very, very skeptical. However, I did give it a go, and I found both to actually be unbelievably rewarding and positive for me. I just can't tell you how it's very difficult to get started. It's very difficult to get into a routine, but I found mindfulness and some form of meditation to be unbelievably powerful and overcoming a whole range of different stresses in your life. You just got no idea how powerful and beneficial that was to me, as well as exercise, particularly exercise. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room. This is sleep. The next one is sleep. We already know that burnout can disrupt your sleep. It can impact on your sleep negatively, through disruptive sleep, through to not getting any sleep at all, finding it difficult to fall asleep, all of those kind of things. Okay, and then even if you do manage to get some sleep, it just doesn't seem to be enough. But we already know that you should be aiming for somewhere around 6 to 7 hours or more, ideally averaging around 7 hours. For me, there's a long history of poor sleep. It was just, I'm happy if I can kind of like get 6 kind of hours. And I'm going to have someone in here to talk to us about sleep soon. And so I'm going to ask him a whole heap of questions about sleep. But obviously sleep is an important component here. So it's about 7 hours, 6 to 7 hours if you can manage it. And I've already mentioned the one about leaving work completely or taking time off from work. Now, that's very complicated. It's very difficult to take time off for work for long periods of time. And I'm not just talking about, taking a week or two off here or there. Obviously, if you go on long-term sick leave, the whole range of complicating factors, one being insurance, all the way through to how are you going to return to work, all the way through to informing your employer, it gets really messy really quickly. In fact, dare I say, it actually becomes more stressful for the individual. Now, managing perfectionism. All right. So talked a little bit about work, talked a little bit about de-stressing strategies. Let's just finished on talking about managing perfectionism. Now, that's a tricky one. I don't have any easy answers to do that. And I am cognizant that I'm planning on doing an episode on perfectionism soon. But I'm just going to leave just with a few kind of little points that I want to finish on. The main one I want to kind of think about is there's a question that you need to answer yourself internally. What is driving the perfectionism? Is it a fear? Is it a fear of failure? Now, I'm kind of answering the question by posing questions because only the individual or the individual in question needs to answer these type of questions. Because if you can answer these questions, and of course, then that's part of the solution. And that's where I think therapy can actually really help. But if that's not something that you're interested in engaging in, and I'm fine with all of that, but I think these are some really important questions you need to ask yourself and be honest with yourself about. So what's actually driving the perfectionism? I've already mentioned before about, that kind of fear of failure. And obviously that, I dare say, is a real driver all the way through to the connection between workaholism and perfectionism. I don't know. There's something really interesting between those kind of relationships that I really don't know enough about yet. However, there is a relationship between the two. I don't want to go too far down that path of perfectionism yet because I know I'm going to be looking at it at some point soon. All right, so let's recap, and then I just want to finish up and just with a few points. So I talked a little bit about what burnout is. So burnout, just to recap, so there's 3 symptoms. So one is energy depletion and exhaustion. The second one is just general negativism and cynicism related to one's job. And then the third one is reduced professional efficacy. And I talked a little bit about some of the causes. So the 3 big causes, as I've already mentioned, is work. The other one is stress, how you respond to stress. And then the third one, which was a real big surprise to me, were personality traits, one being perfectionism, i.e. being perfectionism. That was kind of surprising to me as I did my research for the show. And then the last bit, I just talked a little bit about how to overcome burnout. So I think burnout, part of the challenge is just identifying when you've got it and how it came about. Because it's not always necessarily work. It could be a combination of work and family demands. Like I said before, you're burning the candle at both ends. You're working part-time, and then if you've got kids, you maybe had an issue with one of your children and having to manage that. Or even you might have a parent who's an elderly parent, the whole range of different personal kind of family factors. And over time, that definitely can contribute to burnout. Other one would be corrective factors. I've talked a little bit about those already around how de-stressing kind of strategies. Look, there is, like I said before, there is no one size fits all, but it's about having a go and working out what works best for you. My 3 biggest ones that work well for me and I were definitely sleep, exercise, without a doubt exercise, and of course, meditation, mindfulness type practices. I just that last one was just a massive surprise to me. And then I would seriously ask about the work-related stressor or a work-related factor. Okay, yeah, you might not be able to leave your work, but think about what you could change in your work in relation to work stresses. Like, is there something you maybe could do to change things? So could that be maybe stepping away from a leadership role for a period of time? That is a possibility. You don't have to leave your workplace, you could just step away from some of that responsibility that is a contributing stressor for a period of time. So there are kind of things that you can do, all the way through to potentially going part-time or fractional. So there are a range of different things available to you. So don't think, oh, I can't do anything about my work, I just have to carry on, soldier on. No, I do think there are some things that you can do in relation to work. And the biggie, and I think this is the hardest one, is consider how your personality is contributing to burnout. Now, that is, hands down, that is really challenging. I'm the first person to admit it. Even as I was talking a little bit about perfectionism before, I'm still not sure myself how this notion of, or this personality trait of perfectionism contributes to burnout. It just seems so paradoxical. You know, all those things that's made you successful are the same things that are contributing to burnout. So you can understand why I am a bit stumped. And I might leave it there. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Until next time, stay curious and take care. A huge thank you to my amazing producer, Luke Watson, aka Producer Luke. Your endless support, creativity, and hard work make this podcast possible.